Close your eyes, let the weight of the day dissolve into the darkness behind your eyelids. Tonight, we're going on a journey through time, back to an empire that ruled the world for over 1,000 years. An empire built on blood, ambition, and dreams of eternal glory. This is the story of Rome, from its mythical beginning to its final breath, told in the quiet shadows of history where empires rise and fall like the setting sun. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting off to these historical journeys, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support keeps these timeless stories alive. And if you're already feeling that peaceful pull of sleep, drop a like and let me know in the comments which ancient civilization you'd like to explore next. Now settle in, get comfortable, let your breathing slow, because tonight you're about to witness the rise and fall of the greatest empire the ancient world ever knew. The year is 753 BCE, or so the legend tells us. The Italian peninsula is a patchwork of tribes, scattered villages, and dense forests where wolves howl beneath a canopy of stars. On the banks of the Tiber River, 7 hills rise from the marshy lowlands, and it's here that our story begins, with 2 brothers abandoned as infants, left to die in the wilderness. Their names were Romulus and Remus, twin sons of a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia and the god Mars himself, if you believe the mythology. But mythology and history have always danced together in Rome's story, inseparable, intertwined like vines on ancient stone. The twins were supposed to die, you see. Their great-uncle Amulius had usurped the throne of Alba Longa from their grandfather, and he feared these boys would one day challenge his power, so he ordered them drowned in the Tiber. But the river had other plans. The basket carrying the crying infants washed ashore at the base of the Palatine Hill, where a she-wolf discovered them. Instead of tearing them apart, as wolves do, she nursed them as her own. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus found the boys and raised them as his sons. They grew strong, wild, and ambitious, like the land itself. When Romulus and Remus learned of their true heritage, they overthrew Amulius and restored their grandfather to the throne. But they didn't want Alba Longa. They wanted something new, something that would carry their names through eternity. They decided to build a city on those 7 hills where the wolf had saved them. The problem was they couldn't agree on which hill. Romulus preferred the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. They decided to let the gods choose through augury, watching for signs in the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but then Romulus saw 12. Romulus claimed victory and began to plow a sacred boundary around the Palatine Hill, marking where his city walls would stand. Remus, bitter and mocking, jumped over the shallow furrow, disrespecting his brother's claim. The ancient sources differ on exactly what happened next, but the result was always the same. Romulus killed his own brother, spilling the first blood on Roman soil, and declared, "So perish anyone who leaps over my walls." On April 21st, 753 BCE, Rome was born in fratricide, baptized in brothers' blood. It would be a pattern that echoed through the centuries to come. The early Romans were basically outcasts, refugees, and criminals. Romulus needed to populate his new city, so he opened it as a sanctuary for fugitives from all over the region. Jews fleeing debt, slaves seeking freedom, exiles and troublemakers. They came to Rome and found a fresh start, but there was a problem, a big one. They had no women. Romulus tried negotiating with neighboring tribes, asking for their daughters in marriage. Every single tribe refused. They saw Rome as nothing more than a den of thieves and rejects. So Romulus got creative in a way that would set the tone for Roman ambition. If he couldn't get what he wanted through diplomacy, he'd take it by force. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival in honor of Neptune, a huge celebration with food, wine, and games. The Sabines came with their families, unsuspecting. At a prearranged signal, the Roman men grabbed the Sabine women and carried them off while the Sabine men fled in confusion and rage. This was the famous rape of the Sabines, though rape here means abduction, not necessarily sexual assault, though let's be real, the ancient world was brutal and these women had no choice in the matter. The Sabines naturally wanted revenge and prepared for war, but here's where the story gets interesting, where it becomes something more than just a tale of violence. The Sabine women, now living among the Romans, had begun to build lives. Some had children. When their fathers and brothers returned with an army, the women threw themselves between the two forces, begging them to stop. They argued that if the men fought, the women would either lose their fathers and brothers or their husbands and sons. Either way, they would lose. The Sabine king Titus Tatius and Romulus agreed to merge their peoples. The Sabines and Romans became one, and Romulus and Tatius ruled jointly. When Tatius died a few years later, Romulus became sole king again, but Rome had been transformed. It was no longer just a village of outcasts. It was a real community, multicultural before that was even a word. Romulus ruled for 37 years total. Then one day, during a military review on the Campus Martius, a violent storm erupted. Thunder cracked the sky, wind tore through the assembly, and when the tempest cleared, Romulus had vanished. The senators claimed he'd been taken up to heaven by his father Mars, transformed into the god Quirinus. More cynical historians suggested the senators had murdered him and hidden the body, tired of his increasingly autocratic rule. Either way, Rome's first king was gone, and the age of the 7 kings of Rome had begun. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a complete 180 from the warlike founder. Numa was a philosopher king, a peaceful man who established Rome's religious institutions, creating the calendar, appointing priests, and building temples. He claimed to receive wisdom from the nymph Egeria, who would meet him in a sacred grove. Under Numa's 43-year reign, Rome didn't fight a single war. The gates of the Temple of Janus, which stood open during wartime and closed during peace, remained shut throughout his rule, something that would happen only a handful of times in all of Roman history. Then came Tullus Hostilius, who was basically Numa's opposite. This guy lived for war. He destroyed Alba Longa, Rome's mother city, after a conflict decided by a battle between 2 sets of triplets, the Horatii and Curiatii. The story goes that the 3 Horatii brothers fought the 3 Curiatii brothers to decide the war between Rome and Alba Longa, because I guess that made more sense than full-scale slaughter. 2 Horatii died, but the last one killed all 3 Curiatii through clever tactics. Rome won, Alba Longa was razed, and its people were absorbed into Rome. Tullus ruled with an iron fist until the gods apparently got sick of his warmongering. According to legend, Jupiter himself struck Tullus down with lightning, burning him and his house to ashes. The 4th king was Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, who tried to balance war and peace. He founded Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, giving Rome its first port and access to Mediterranean trade. He built Rome's first prison and the first bridge across the Tiber. Under his rule, Rome began to look less like a hilltop village and more like a real city. But the most transformative kings were yet to come, and they weren't even Roman by birth. They were Etruscan, from the sophisticated civilization that dominated central Italy before Rome became a superpower. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the first. Born in the Etruscan city of Tarquinio to a Greek father, he migrated to Rome seeking opportunity. He was wealthy, charismatic, and ambitious as hell. He maneuvered his way into becoming king after Ancus Marcius died, and he transformed Rome from a backwater into something magnificent. Tarquin built the Circus Maximus, where Romans would watch chariot races for the next 1,000 years. He started construction on the great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which would become the symbolic heart of Roman power. He drained the swampy valley between the hills, creating the Forum Romanum, the public square that would witness every major event in Roman history. He expanded the Senate and the military, bringing Etruscan engineering, architecture, and culture into Roman life. But Tarquin's ambition made enemies. The sons of Ancus Marcius, who felt they should have inherited the throne, had him assassinated. Here's where it gets wild though. Tarquin's wife, Tanaquil, was one smart and ruthless woman. When Tarquin was dying from his wounds, she concealed his death and announced from a palace window that he was only injured and had appointed his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, as temporary regent. By the time everyone realized Tarquin was actually dead, Servius had consolidated enough power that he just stayed king. Servius Tullius was possibly a slave's son, depending on which version of the story you believe, making his rise to kingship one of the most remarkable in Roman history. He ruled for 44 years and fundamentally restructured Roman society, dividing citizens into classes based on wealth rather than birth, creating the census, and building the massive Servian wall around the city's 7 hills. But Servius made a fatal mistake. He had 2 daughters, both named Tullia, and he married them to 2 sons of Tarquin named Aruns and Lucius. The Tullias had opposite personalities, one gentle, one viciously ambitious. Naturally, the ambitious Tullia ended up married to the peaceful Aruns, while the gentle Tullia married the ambitious Lucius. If you're thinking this sounds like a recipe for disaster, you're absolutely right. Ambitious Tullia and Lucius murdered their respective spouses and married each other, creating a power couple straight out of a nightmare. Tullia pushed her new husband to seize the throne from her own father. Lucius stormed the Senate house, declared himself king, and when old Servius confronted him, Lucius threw him down the Senate steps. As Servius lay dying in the street, Tullia drove her chariot over her father's body, literally and figuratively, and legend says the street ran red with his blood. This Lucius Tarquinius became known as Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and he would be Rome's last king. His reign was marked by tyranny, violence, and building projects funded by forced labor. He completed his grandfather's Temple of Jupiter and expanded Rome's power through military conquest. But he ruled through fear, executing senators on trumped-up charges and surrounding himself with bodyguards. The end came in 509 BCE, and it involved, of course, a woman and violence. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the wife of his cousin Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. Lucretia told her father and husband what happened, made them swear to avenge her, and then stabbed herself to death, declaring that no woman should use her example to excuse unchastity. Her suicide sparked a revolution. A nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had been playing dumb for years to avoid Tarquin's paranoia, rallied the people. He displayed Lucretia's body in the forum, and the crowd's rage erupted like a volcano. They exiled the entire Tarquinian family, abolished the monarchy, and established the Roman Republic. Rome would never again call any man king. The very word rex became an insult, synonymous with tyranny. For the next 5 centuries, Rome would be governed by elected magistrates, with power split between 2 consuls who served for only 1 year, each with veto power over the other. It was designed to prevent any single man from becoming too powerful. It was one of history's greatest experiments in governance, and it would carry Rome from a single city to an empire spanning 3 continents. The early republic was chaotic, violent, and perpetually at war. Rome was surrounded by enemies: the Etruscans to the north, the Sabines and Equi to the east, the Volsci to the south, and dozens of Latin tribes all around. The new government was fragile, and everyone seemed to want to crush it. According to legend, the exiled Tarquin convinced Lars Porsena, the king of the Etruscan city of Clusium, to attack Rome and restore the monarchy. The Romans fought desperately. One story tells of Horatius Cockles, who held the Sublician Bridge against the entire Etruscan army while his fellow Romans destroyed it behind him. When the bridge finally collapsed, Horatius, in full armor, jumped into the Tiber and swam to safety. Another story features Mucius Scaevola, who snuck into the Etruscan camp to assassinate Porsena but killed the wrong man. When captured, he thrust his right hand into a fire and held it there, burning without flinching, to show Porsena that Romans feared nothing. Porsena was so impressed he made peace. These stories might be propaganda, myths to inspire courage, but they reveal something true about Roman identity. Romans saw themselves as tougher, more disciplined, more willing to sacrifice than anyone else. That self-image became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the Republic wasn't just fighting external enemies. Inside Rome, class warfare threatened to tear everything apart. Society was divided between patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the old aristocratic families who monopolized political power, claiming descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus. Plebeians were everyone else, the common people who made up the bulk of the army and the economy, but had almost no political rights. The plebeians couldn't hold high office, couldn't marry patricians, and didn't even know what the laws were because they weren't written down. Patrician judges just made it up as they went, always in their own favor. Plebeians could be sold into slavery to pay debts. It was a system designed to keep them powerless. In 494 BCE, the plebeians had enough. They went on strike, basically. They marched out of Rome en masse and camped on a hill called the Sacred Mount, refusing to come back or fight in the army. This was called the First Secession of the Plebs, and it freaked the patricians out because without the plebeians, there was no army, no economy, nothing. Rome would collapse. The patricians were forced to negotiate. The plebeians won the right to elect their own representatives called tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to veto any law or action that harmed plebeian interests. The tribunes' persons were sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed them could be killed without trial. It was the first major victory in what would be a 200-year struggle for political equality. In 451–450 BCE, the plebeians forced the creation of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code. The laws were harsh, even brutal by modern standards, but at least now everyone knew what they were. You can still see their influence today in modern legal systems. They covered everything from property rights to family law to the procedures for trials. Struggle continued. In 445 BCE, plebeians won the right to marry patricians through the lex canulea. In 367 BCE, the Licinian section laws required that one of the 2 consuls be a plebeian. Slowly, painfully, the plebeians fought their way toward equality, and honestly, if you're starting to drift off, that's perfect. Let these ancient political battles wash over you like waves. You don't need to remember every date, every law. Just feel the slow march of history. By 287 BCE, after multiple secessions and centuries of conflict, the conflict of the orders essentially ended when the Lex Hortensia made decisions by the plebeian assembly binding on all Romans, patrician and plebeian alike. A new nobility emerged, the nobles, mixing old patrician families with wealthy plebeian ones. Rome had become more meritocratic, more inclusive, and paradoxically more powerful. Because here's the thing, this constant internal struggle forced Rome to be flexible, to adapt, to incorporate new people and new ideas. It made the Republic stronger, more resilient than the rigid monarchies and oligarchies that surrounded it, and that strength was about to be tested like never before. While Rome fought its internal battles, it was also conquering its neighbors. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Rome systematically absorbed or destroyed every nearby tribe and city. The Equi, the Volsci, the Sabines all fell. The Latin League, an alliance of Latin cities that had sometimes allied with Rome, turned against it, and Rome crushed them in the Latin War of 343–38 BCE. But Rome's genius wasn't just military, it was political. Instead of simply enslaving or exterminating conquered peoples, Rome often offered them Roman citizenship or allied status. Defeated cities became Roman municipalities, their elites absorbed into Roman society, their soldiers enrolled in Roman legions. It was assimilation through integration, and it worked brilliantly. Every conquest made Rome stronger because it turned enemies into Romans. The system wasn't always fair or generous. Different communities got different deals. Some became full Roman citizens, others Latin citizens with partial rights, others Italian allies bound by treaty. But the possibility of advancement was there, the promise that your grandchildren might be full Romans with all the rights that entailed. It gave people a stake in Rome's success. This strategy would allow Rome to dominate Italy, then the Mediterranean, then the known world. But first, it had to survive its greatest challenge yet, a war that would determine whether Rome or Carthage would rule the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was everything Rome wasn't. It was ancient, founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre around 814 BCE, making it older than Rome itself. It was fabulously wealthy from trade, controlling ports across North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Its navy was the most powerful in the Mediterranean. Carthage was cosmopolitan, mercantile, sophisticated. Rome was agricultural, militaristic, provincial. They were bound to collide, and they did, 3 times, in conflicts that would reshape the ancient world. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BCE over Sicily. Some mercenaries called the Mamertines had seized the city of Messana and were being threatened by Syracuse. They asked both Rome and Carthage for help. Both sent armies. Instead of negotiating, they went to war, and the war lasted 23 years. Rome had a problem, though. They weren't a naval power, and you can't fight Carthage without a navy. So they did something insane. They found a wrecked Carthaginian warship, reverse-engineered it, and built an entire fleet from scratch. They trained their rowers on dry land, sitting on benches arranged like ships, learning the motions before they ever touched water. Then they added a Roman twist. Carthaginian ships were faster and more maneuverable, crewed by experienced sailors. Roman ships couldn't outmaneuver them, so Rome didn't even try. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike on the end. When a Roman ship got close to a Carthaginian one, they'd drop the corvus, it would slam into the enemy deck and stick there, and Roman marines would charge across. They turned naval battles into land battles, playing to Roman strengths. It worked. Rome won battle after battle. They lost entire fleets to storms that killed hundreds of thousands of men, and they just built new fleets and kept coming. Carthage sued for peace in 241 BCE. Rome took Sicily, turning it into Rome's first province outside Italy. A few years later, when Carthage was distracted by a mercenary revolt, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica too. Carthage was humiliated, forced to pay a massive indemnity, stripped of its islands. The Barcid family, Carthage's leading military dynasty, never forgave Rome. Hamilcar Barca took his 9-year-old son to Spain, made him swear eternal hatred of Rome on an altar, and spent years building a new Carthaginian empire in Iberia to replace what was lost. That 9-year-old boy's name was Hannibal. If you're still awake, you might want to grab some water, get even more comfortable, because Hannibal's story is one of the most incredible in all of military history, and we're just getting started. And hey, if you're enjoying this journey through Rome's story, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more people find these deep dives into history. Alright, let's get back to it. Hannibal Barca became the greatest general Rome ever faced, maybe the greatest general of the ancient world, period. By his mid-20s, he commanded Carthage's army in Spain. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly committed to destroying Rome. In 218 BCE, Hannibal did something that military historians still study in disbelief. He decided to invade Italy, not by sea where Rome's new navy could intercept him, but by land. He marched an army of about 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants from Spain, through southern Gaul across the Alps into northern Italy. The Alpine crossing was a nightmare. It was late autumn, snow already covering the passes. The narrow mountain paths crumbled under the weight of elephants. Gallic tribes attacked the column. Men and animals fell to their deaths. Hannibal lost nearly half his army in the crossing, but when he emerged into the Po Valley, he had achieved complete strategic surprise. Rome had expected him to come by sea or not at all. Instead, he was in Italy with veteran soldiers and cavalry superior to anything Rome could field. Over the next 3 years, Hannibal destroyed every Roman army sent against him. At the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, he lured a Roman army into a freezing river, then ambushed them with hidden forces. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he caught another Roman army in a morning fog and trapped them against the lake shore, killing 15,000 Romans in 3 hours. But these were just warm-ups. The real disaster came in 216 BCE at Cannae. The Romans, desperate to end the war, raised the largest army in their history, maybe 80,000 men, more than double Hannibal's 50,000. They were commanded by 2 consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who alternated command daily, because Rome still didn't trust any single general with too much power. Hannibal deployed his army in a crescent formation, with weak troops in the center and his best forces on the wings. Varro, commanding that day, saw the weak center and ordered a direct charge, seeking to punch through and win quickly. The center gave way, bending back but not breaking, and the overconfident Romans pushed forward, their formation growing tighter and tighter as they packed into the bulging center. Then Hannibal sprang the trap. His cavalry, having destroyed the Roman cavalry on the flanks, swung behind the Roman army. His heavy infantry on the wings closed in from the sides. The Romans were completely surrounded, 80,000 men packed so tightly they couldn't even raise their weapons. For hours, Carthaginian soldiers just stood at the edge of the mass and killed. They killed until their arms were too tired to lift their swords. By the end of the day, 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were dead, including Paulus and 80 senators who had fought in the ranks. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history. Cannae became synonymous with perfect tactical victory, studied by generals from Julius Caesar to Norman Schwarzkopf. Hannibal had annihilated Rome's army. And yet Rome didn't surrender. That's the thing about Rome that Hannibal never quite understood. Other cities, other kingdoms they would have sued for peace, accepted defeat. Rome just kept going. They refused to even acknowledge Hannibal's messengers. They raised new armies from boys too young to serve and old men too old to fight. They freed slaves and armed them. They told their Italian allies that any city that defected to Hannibal would be destroyed, and they meant it. Hannibal marched up and down Italy for 13 more years, winning battle after battle, but he could never take Rome itself. He didn't have siege equipment, and Rome's walls were too strong. Most of Rome's Italian allies stayed loyal, fearing Roman vengeance more than they hoped for Carthaginian victory. Hannibal was trapped in a strategic stalemate, winning tactically but unable to achieve his strategic goal. Rome adapted. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a temporary position of absolute power used in emergencies. Fabius refused to fight Hannibal directly. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, cutting off foragers, raiding supply lines, avoiding battle. The Romans mocked him as the delayer, but his Fabian strategy worked. It wore Hannibal down, turned Rome's strategic depth, its vast manpower reserves and Italian allies into an unstoppable advantage. Meanwhile, Rome struck back in Spain. A young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had both died fighting in Spain, took command of Roman forces there at age 25. He was too young for the position technically, but Rome was desperate. Scipio proved to be a military genius on Hannibal's level. He captured Carthago Nova, Carthage's capital in Spain, in a single day through brilliant tactics. He defeated the Carthaginian armies in Spain one by one, and by 206 BCE, Spain was Rome's. Then Scipio did something audacious. He proposed invading Africa and taking the war to Carthage itself. The Senate was skeptical. Why risk losing their best general in an overseas adventure when Hannibal was still in Italy? But Scipio was given permission to go, and in 204 BCE, he landed in North Africa with a Roman army. Carthage panicked and recalled Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years of campaigning in enemy territory, Hannibal finally came home, and the two greatest generals of their age prepared to face each other at Zama in 202 BCE. Before the battle, they met face-to-face, alone, to negotiate. Can you imagine it? Hannibal, the veteran warrior who had terrorized Rome for 16 years, and Scipio, the young Roman who had conquered Spain and now threatened Carthage itself. They talked for hours, each trying to take the other's measure, but neither would back down. The next day they fought. Hannibal had war elephants, 80 of them, which he sent charging at the Roman lines, but Scipio had prepared for this. He opened corridors in his formation. And the elephants, hearing Roman trumpets and drums and clashing weapons, stampeded harmlessly through the gaps. Scipio's cavalry, reinforced by Numidian horsemen under King Massinissa who had switched sides, destroyed Hannibal's cavalry and swung behind the Carthaginian army. It was Cannae in reverse. Hannibal's army was crushed. Carthage sued for peace. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had won, but just barely, and at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Carthage was allowed to survive, but just barely. They lost all their territory outside Africa, their navy was reduced to 10 ships, they had to pay a crushing indemnity, and they were forbidden from making war without Roman permission. Carthage was broken. Scipio returned to Rome as a hero, taking the honorific name Africanus for his victory in Africa. Hannibal lived on for years, serving Carthage in various capacities, but Rome never stopped hunting him. He fled to the east, served various kings as a mercenary and advisor, always staying one step ahead of Roman agents. Finally, in 183 BCE, surrounded by Romans at a villa in Bithynia, the old warrior took poison rather than be captured. He was 64 years old. His last words were supposedly, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Even in deaths, Hannibal defied Rome. The 50 years after Hannibal were spent conquering the East. Rome had no grand plan for empire, at least not consciously. It just kept getting dragged into one conflict after another, each victory opening up new opportunities, new threats, new wars. In 200 BCE, Rome went to war with Macedon, ostensibly to protect Greek city-states from Macedonian aggression. At Cynoscephaly in 197 BCE, a Roman army under Titus Quinctius Flamininus destroyed the Macedonian phalanx, proving that the Roman legion's flexibility was superior to the old Greek formation's rigid power. Rome declared the Greek cities free, and at the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE, Flamininus announced this to a shocked audience. The Greeks went wild with joy, showering the Romans with honors, convinced their liberators had come. They didn't understand yet that Rome never really left anywhere. The Seleucid Empire, one of the successor kingdoms to Alexander's empire, ruled most of the Near East. Its king, Antiochus III, called the Great, invaded Greece, seeing an opportunity to expand. Rome warned him off. He ignored them. That was a mistake. At Thermopylae in 191 BCE, the same pass where the Spartans had fought Persia centuries before, Rome defeated Antiochus. The Seleucid king fled to Asia Minor. Rome followed. At Magnesia in 190 BCE, the brothers Scipio, Africanus, and his younger brother Lucius commanded a Roman army that annihilated Antiochus's forces. The Seleucid Empire was humbled, forced to pay a massive indemnity and abandon all territory in Asia Minor. Rome kept being drawn back to Macedon. A third war broke out in 171 BCE. At Pydna in 168 BCE, Lucius Aemilius Paulus commanded a Roman army that crushed the Macedonian phalanx so thoroughly that Macedon ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Rome divided it into 4 client republics. That same year, far to the south, Rome humiliated the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. He was besieging Alexandria in Egypt, about to conquer it, when a Roman envoy named Gaius Popilius Lenas showed up. Antiochus greeted him warmly and said he needed time to consult with his advisors about Rome's demands to withdraw. Lenas took his staff and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. He said, "Before you step out of that circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate." Antiochus stood there, a king with a massive army at his back, humiliated by one old Roman with a stick. After a long moment he said, "I will do what the Senate thinks right," and withdrew. Egypt was saved without Rome firing a single arrow. That's the thing about Rome by the mid-2nd century BCE. It didn't even need to fight anymore. Its reputation alone could end wars, but reputation can breed resentment, and not everyone was willing to bow. Carthage, amazingly, had recovered. Stripped of its empire and military, it had turned to trade and industry and had become wealthy again. Rome watched this recovery with growing paranoia. A senator named Marcus Porcius Cato, called Cato the Elder, ended every single speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Rome picked a fight. When Carthage defended itself against raids by Numidia, Rome claimed this violated the treaty that forbade Carthage from making war without permission. Rome demanded Carthage surrender 300 noble children as hostages. Carthage complied. Rome demanded Carthage surrender all its weapons. Carthage complied. Then Rome demanded that Carthage abandon its city and rebuild at least 10 miles from the coast. That was too much. Carthage would lose everything, its harbor, its trade, its identity. The Carthaginians decided to fight. With no weapons, they melted down statues and tools, women cut their hair to make bowstrings, and they prepared for a siege. The Third Punic War lasted from 149 to 146 BCE, and it was just a siege of Carthage. The city held out for 3 years against overwhelming Roman force. Finally, in the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, commanded the final assault. Roman soldiers fought house to house for 6 days. They threw the defenders from the rooftops. They set buildings on fire with people inside. By the end, 50,000 Carthaginians were sold into slavery. The The city was systematically demolished, every building torn down. According to legend, the Romans plowed the ruins and sowed them with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. That's probably not true. Salt was too expensive to waste like that, and the Romans actually founded a colony there a century later. But the story persists because it captures the totality of Carthage's destruction. On the same day Carthage fell on the other side of the Mediterranean, Rome destroyed Corinth in Greece for leading a rebellion. The city was burned, its population enslaved, its art treasures shipped to Rome. Greece was reorganized as a Roman province. In a single year, Rome had annihilated two of the Mediterranean's great civilizations. The message was clear. Rome ruled the Mediterranean, and resistance was futile. But empire has a price, and Rome was about to pay it. All that conquest brought massive wealth into Rome, but it was concentrated in the hands of the elite. Senators and wealthy families bought up huge estates in Italy, worked by the millions of slaves captured in the wars. Small farmers, the backbone of the Roman army and society, couldn't compete. They lost their land and drifted to Rome, swelling the urban poor. The army changed too. It used to be that only landowners could serve in the legions, because they could afford their own equipment and had a stake in defending Rome. But with fewer landowners, Rome's military manpower was shrinking. The Republic was becoming an empire, but its institutions were still designed for a city-state. In 133 BCE, a young tribune named Tiberius Gracchus tried to fix this. He proposed land reform, redistributing public land from the wealthy to the poor, creating a new class of small farmers who could serve in the army. It was a reasonable proposal that addressed a real crisis, but the Senate saw it as an attack on their wealth and power. When Tiberius tried to run for tribune a second consecutive year, which was technically illegal but not unprecedented, the Senate claimed he was trying to become a tyrant. A mob of senators and their supporters, led by the Pontifex Maximus, clubbed Tiberius to death along with 300 of his followers and threw their bodies into the Tiber. It was the first time in the Republic's history that political violence had been used against a Roman magistrate, and it shattered a norm that had held for centuries. The Republic had always had fierce debates, bitter rivalries, intense competition, but you didn't kill your opponents. The Gracchi crisis changed that. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius Gracchus became tribune and pushed even more radical reforms. He expanded his brother's land program, subsidized grain for the urban poor, extended citizenship to more Italians, and challenged the Senate's monopoly on power. For 2 years, he dominated Roman politics, but then the Senate turned on him too. In 121 BCE, the Senate passed something called the Ultimate Decree, declaring a state of emergency and authorizing the consuls to do whatever was necessary to preserve the Republic. Gaius and 3,000 of his supporters were killed. Rome had crossed a line. Political disputes could now be settled with violence, with massacres, with mob rule. The next century would see this poison spread until it destroyed the Republic entirely. But we're not there yet. Let yourself relax into these darkening times. Let the weight of history settle over you like a blanket. As Rome's internal conflicts escalated, its external empire kept growing. In 113 BCE, 2 Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, migrated into Roman territory, crushing army after army. In 105 BCE, at Arausio in Gaul, they destroyed a Roman force of 80,000 men, Rome's worst defeat since Cannae. A general named Gaius Marius saved Rome. Marius was new man, a novus homo from a family that had never held high office. He rose through sheer talent and ambition, and when the Germanic threat loomed, Rome turned to him. He was elected consul in 107 BCE and then, breaking all precedent, re-elected every year until 100 BCE. Marius reformed the army. He abolished the property requirement for service, opening the legions to the urban poor. These new soldiers were no longer farmer citizens serving for a season. They were professional warriors whose loyalty was to their general, who promised them land and loot after their service. It made the army more effective, but also more dangerous politically. Soldiers now followed their generals, not the state. Marius crushed the Germanic tribes at Aquae in 102 BCE and Vercelli in 101 BCE, saving Italy from invasion. He was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus, but his reforms had planted the seeds of civil war. In 91 BCE, Rome's Italian allies, who had fought and bled for Rome for centuries but still didn't have citizenship, rebelled. The social war from socii, meaning allies, raged across Italy. Rome was forced to grant citizenship to most Italians to end the war, finally creating a unified Italy. But the war left scars and veterans who expected rewards from their generals, not the Senate. In 88 BCE, Mithridates VI of Pontus, a kingdom in Asia Minor, invaded Rome's eastern provinces. He orchestrated a massacre of 80,000 Roman and Italian civilians in a single day. Rome needed to respond, and both Marius and a younger general named Lucius Cornelius Sulla wanted the command. The Senate gave it to Sulla. The popular assemblies, influenced by Marius's allies, took it away and gave it to Marius. Sulla's response was unprecedented. He marched his legions on Rome itself, the first time a Roman general had ever done that. He seized the city, declared Marius and his allies public enemies, and restored the Senate's authority. Then he left for the east to fight Mithridates. While Sulla was gone, Marius returned with his own army, took Rome, and launched a reign of terror, killing his enemies and displaying their heads in the Forum. Marius died in 86 BCE, but his allies held Rome until Sulla returned in 83 BCE with his legions. The civil war that followed was horrific. Sulla marched on Rome again, fought battles across Italy, and in 82 BCE at the Colline Gate right outside Rome, he destroyed the last army opposing him. Then he did something Rome had never seen. He posted lists of names in the Forum, proscription lists, naming his enemies. Anyone on the list could be killed without trial, and the killer would receive a reward. Their property would be confiscated and auctioned off. Thousands died, their heads brought to Sulla for the bounty, their fortunes stolen. Sulla had himself appointed dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but indefinitely, for the restoration of the Republic. He used absolute power to restructure Roman government, strengthening the Senate, limiting the tribunes, reforming the courts. In 79 BCE, confident his reforms had saved the Republic, Sulla resigned his dictatorship and retired to his villa. He died a year later. His reforms failed almost immediately. The fundamental problem remained. Rome was an empire governed by city-state institutions, and the army now followed its generals, not the state. Sulla's example taught a generation of ambitious men that if you had an army, you could take Rome and do whatever you wanted. One of those men would become the most famous Roman who ever lived. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE to an old patrician family that had fallen on hard times. His aunt was married to Marius, which put young Caesar on Sulla's proscription lists. He survived by going into hiding, but the experience taught him that in Rome, you either had power or you were at the mercy of those who did. Caesar climbed the political ladder through charm, ruthless ambition, and spectacular debts. He borrowed vast sums to fund public games and bribe voters. By 63 BCE, he was elected Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, a position he held for life. In 59 BCE, he became consul, but he didn't do it alone. Caesar formed an alliance with two other powerful men, creating what historians call the First Triumvirate, though they never called it that themselves. The three were Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey was Rome's greatest general since Sulla. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered the East, and doubled Rome's annual revenue. He had celebrated a triumph, parading through Rome with wagons of treasure and thousands of captives. He was, in his own estimation, basically the new Alexander the Great. But the Senate, jealous and fearful, had blocked many of his proposals, refusing to ratify his eastern settlement or provide land for his veterans. Crassus was Rome's richest man. He had made his fortune in Sulla's proscriptions, buying up confiscated estates for pennies, and through various businesses including a private fire brigade that would show up at burning buildings and refuse to fight the fire until the owner sold the property to Crassus at a discount. He wanted political power to match his wealth. Caesar needed their support to achieve his ambitions. Together, the three dominated Rome. Caesar used his consulship to pass Pompey's legislation and secure himself the governorship of Gaul for 5 years. Gaul is modern France, and controlling it gave Caesar an army, an opportunity for conquest, and a way to build the glory and wealth he needed to compete with Pompey. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar conquered Gaul in a brutal series of campaigns that killed an estimated 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. He wrote commentaries on the wars, propaganda masterpieces that portrayed him as a civilizing hero bringing order to barbarian chaos, when really he was just looting and murdering his way to glory. But it worked. His name became legendary. His soldiers were fanatically loyal. He was rich beyond measure. In 53 BCE, Crassus, jealous of Caesar's and Pompey's military fame, led an army against the Parthian Empire in the east. At Carrhae, the Parthians destroyed his army. Crassus was captured and, according to legend, executed by having molten gold poured down his throat, a fitting end for Rome's richest man. His death ended the triumvirate. Without Crassus as a balance, Caesar and Pompey turned on each other. Pompey allied with the Senate, which was terrified of Caesar. They demanded Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would leave him vulnerable to prosecution for the illegal acts he'd committed as consul. Caesar refused. On January 10, 49 BCE, he led his 13th legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy. Crossing it with an army was treason, an act of war against Rome itself. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar said alia iacta est, the die is cast, though he probably said it in Greek, not Latin. Either way, there was no going back. Civil war erupted. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece, planning to raise armies in the east. Caesar marched through Italy almost unopposed, then chased Pompey to Spain, Greece, and finally Egypt. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's veteran legions destroyed Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary. Instead, the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, thinking to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey murdered and his head cut off. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, Ptolemy presented him with Pompey's head. Caesar allegedly wept, whether from genuine grief for his former friend and son-in-law, or from anger that his enemy had been killed without his permission. We'll never know. He had Pompey's murderers executed. Then Caesar got involved in a civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife, Cleopatra VII. He sided with Cleopatra, defeated Ptolemy, and made Cleopatra queen. He stayed in Egypt for months, apparently having an affair with her. She bore a son she claimed was Caesar's, naming him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar spent the next few years mopping up resistance. In Asia Minor, he crushed a rebellion so quickly he sent a message to the Senate. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. In Africa. He defeated the last senatorial forces at Thapsus. In Spain, he won his final victory at Munda in 45 BCE. He returned to Rome as undisputed master of the Roman world. He had himself appointed dictator for life, broke every republican tradition, and ruled as a monarch in all but name. He pardoned most of his enemies, showing clemency, though whether from genuine mercy or calculated policy is debatable. He launched massive building projects, reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar we still use today, planned campaigns against Parthia and Dacia, and basically tried to solve Rome's fundamental problems through personal rule. But he kept the forms of the Republic. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected. Caesar just controlled everything behind the scenes. Some saw him as a necessary strongman, bringing order after decades of chaos. Others saw him as a tyrant destroying the Republic, no matter how broken that Republic had been. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of senators led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus lured Caesar to a Senate meeting and stabbed him to death. He received 23 wounds. According to legend, when he saw Brutus among the attackers, he said, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus." Then he pulled his toga over his face and died at the base of Pompey's statue. The assassins, calling themselves liberators, thought they had saved the Republic. They had actually doomed it, because Caesar, for all his ambition and ruthlessness, had been trying to fix Rome's systemic problems. The liberators had no plan beyond killing Caesar. They thought the Republic would just magically restore itself. It didn't. Caesar's assassination triggered another round of civil wars that would finally kill the Republic for good. If you're still here, still listening, maybe pause for a second and drop a comment about what you think of Caesar. Was he a tyrant or a reformer, hero or villain? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. We're going to follow this story all the way to the end, and trust me, we're just getting to the craziest part. After Caesar's death, Rome descended into chaos. The assassins expected to be hailed as heroes. Instead, Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man and co-consul, turned the people against them. At Caesar's funeral, Antony gave a famous speech, displaying Caesar's bloody toga, reading his will that left money to every Roman citizen. The crowd rioted. The assassins fled Rome. But Antony wasn't the only one claiming Caesar's legacy. There was also Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son. Caesar's will named Octavian as his heir, and the kid, despite his youth and sickliness, immediately claimed his inheritance. Antony dismissed him as a boy. That was Antony's first mistake. Octavian was patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless beneath a veneer of propriety. He raised an army from Caesar's veterans, allied with the Senate against Antony, then betrayed the Senate and allied with Antony when it suited him. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and another Caesarian general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first triumvirate, this one was official, a three-man dictatorship with legal authority to remake the state. Their first act was a proscription, just like Sulla's. They posted lists of enemies to be killed, confiscating their property to fund their war against Caesar's assassins. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and a supporter of the Republic, was on the list. He tried to flee but was caught. Soldiers cut off his head and his hands, which had written speeches against Antony. Antony's wife, Fulvia, allegedly pulled out Cicero's tongue and stabbed it repeatedly with her hairpin, revenge for his verbal attacks on her husband. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy Romans died. Their property was auctioned off. The triumvirate raised legions and marched east to face Brutus and Cassius, who had seized control of Rome's eastern provinces. At Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BCE, the Caesarians faced the Republicans in 2 battles. Brutus won the first, but Cassius, thinking all was lost, committed suicide. 3 weeks later, Antony and Octavian crushed Brutus's army. Brutus also committed suicide, dying on the same sword he'd used to kill Caesar. The Republic's last defenders were dead. Now the question was who would rule the corpse. The triumvirate divided the Roman world. Lepidus got Africa, but he was clearly the junior partner. Antony took the wealthy east. Octavian got Italy and the west, which sounds like a raw deal, but it meant he controlled Rome itself. Antony went to the east to raise money and prepare for a war against Parthia, which had humiliated Rome by defeating Crassus and then invading Roman territory during the civil wars. In Egypt, he met Cleopatra. Like Caesar before him, he fell for her, though whether it was love, lust, political calculation, or all three is impossible to say. They became lovers and allies. She supported his campaigns with Egyptian wealth. He gave her Roman territories. They had 3 children together. Meanwhile, Octavian faced a different kind of war. In Italy, people were angry about land confiscations to provide farms for veterans. Antony's brother and wife stirred up rebellion. Octavian crushed them, but it was a near thing. He also faced Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, who controlled Sicily and was cutting off Rome's grain supply. It took years and the help of Octavian's brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, to finally defeat Sextus. By 36 BCE, Octavian was secure enough to sideline Lepidus, leaving just him and Antony as the 2 powers in the Roman world. Their alliance was fraying. Octavian's sister Octavia had married Antony to seal their partnership, but Antony preferred Cleopatra. He started acting like an Eastern monarch, which played terribly in Rome. Octavian's propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting Antony as a traitor to Rome, bewitched by an Oriental queen who wanted to rule Rome from Alexandria. In 32 BCE, Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and read it in the Senate. It supposedly said Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria and left territories to his children with Cleopatra. Rome was outraged. The Senate stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not on Antony directly, which would be civil war, but on Cleopatra. The final confrontation came in 31 BCE at Actium, a naval battle off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, faced Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces. The battle was indecisive until suddenly, in the middle of the fight, Cleopatra's squadron broke off and sailed away. Antony abandoned his own fleet and followed her. Whether this was a planned retreat or a panicked flight is still debated, but the result was the same. Antony's fleet surrendered. His army soon followed. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Octavian pursued them, and in 30 BCE he invaded. Antony, hearing a false report that Cleopatra was dead, stabbed himself. He was carried dying to Cleopatra and expired in her arms. A few days later, Cleopatra killed herself, supposedly by allowing an asp to bite her, though poison was more likely. Octavian had their son Caesarion, Caesar's only biological son, hunted down and killed. Can't have rival heirs. He took Egypt as his personal property, not a province of Rome but his own private kingdom. The wealth of Egypt, the last Hellenistic kingdom, was his. At 33 years old, Gaius Octavius, adopted son of Julius Caesar, stood alone as master of the Roman world. Every rival was dead, every threat was crushed. The question now was what he would do with that power. The answer would transform Rome from a republic into an empire, and Octavian into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Octavian was smart enough to learn from Caesar's mistakes. He wouldn't flaunt his power or rule as a dictator. Instead, he'd hide his monarchy behind republican forms, maintaining the illusion that he'd restored the republic even as he destroyed it completely. In 27 BCE, Octavian appeared before the Senate and announced he was resigning all his powers, laying them at the Senate's feet. The Senate, packed with his supporters, begged him to stay. After suitable reluctance, he agreed to accept the governorship of several key provinces, which happened to contain most of the legions and various powers and honors. The Senate granted him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one, a title with religious overtones but not the monarchical baggage of king. Augustus claimed he had restored the republic. In reality, he'd created a new system that historians call the Principate, from princeps, meaning first citizen. He held multiple powers simultaneously: imperium, giving him command of the armies; tribunician power, making him sacrosanct and able to veto anything; control of Egypt; the authority of the Pontifex Maximus, making him chief priest; and the simple prestige of being Augustus, avenger of Caesar, pacifier of the civil wars, the man who had saved Rome. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected, laws were still passed, but Augustus was always there, guiding, suggesting, influencing. If the Senate did something he didn't like, he'd politely veto it or just replace the offending senators. It was monarchy disguised as republic, and it worked brilliantly. Augustus ruled for 41 years, from 27 BCE to 14 CE. He reformed everything. He created Rome's first professional standing army, with soldiers serving for 20 years and receiving land and money upon discharge. He established the Praetorian Guard to protect himself, a decision that would have huge consequences later when the Praetorians realized they could make and unmake emperors. He reformed taxation, conducted a census, built roads, aqueducts, and temples across the empire. He boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He reformed morality, or tried to. Augustus was personally modest, living simply despite his vast wealth. He wore homespun clothes made by his wife and daughter. He slept in the same small bedroom for 40 years. He promoted traditional Roman values, passing laws to encourage marriage and childbearing, punish adultery, and restore old religious rites. It was mostly propaganda, and his own family constantly violated these moral standards, but the image mattered. The borders were pushed outward and consolidated. Augustus conquered Spain, pacified Gaul, advanced into Germany until disaster struck in 9 CE when Germanic tribes under Arminius ambushed and destroyed 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. 20,000 men dead, lost in the German wilderness. Augustus reportedly banged his head against the walls, crying, "Quintilius Verus, give me back my legions." Rome never recovered those eagle standards, or seriously tried to conquer Germany again. The Rhine and Danube became permanent frontiers. In the east, Augustus made peace with Parthia, recovering the eagles lost by Crassus through diplomacy rather than war. He annexed Egypt, Judea, and various other territories, transforming the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. For the first time in a century, the doors of the Temple of Janus were closed, signifying peace throughout the empire. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it would last for 2 centuries. Under its protection, trade flourished, cities grew, art and literature thrived. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Rome's national epic, connecting Roman origins to the fall of Troy and justifying Roman rule as destiny. Horace composed odes praising Augustus. Livy wrote his history of Rome. It was a golden age, at least for the people at the top. But Augustus faced a personal tragedy. He had no sons, only a daughter, Julia. He married her off to his friend Agrippa, hoping their sons could inherit. 3 sons were born, but Agrippa died young. Augustus forced his stepson Tiberius from his wife Livia's first marriage to divorce his pregnant wife and marry Julia, securing the succession. Julia hated Tiberius. She engaged in such flagrant adultery that even Augustus couldn't ignore it. He exiled his own daughter to a barren island, where she died years later, isolated and miserable. Augustus's grandsons and intended heirs, Gaius and Lucius, both died young in mysterious circumstances. By 4 CE, Augustus was 70 and running out of options. He adopted Tiberius, his stepson, as his heir, even though he apparently disliked the man. Tiberius was capable, experienced, but dour and suspicious, the complete opposite of Augustus's carefully cultivated image. In 14 CE, at age 76, Augustus died at Nola, in the same room his father had died in decades before. His last words were supposedly to his wife Livia, "Livia, remember our marriage, farewell." Then, showing his theatrical nature to the end, he asked those present if he had played his part in the comedy of life well and requested applause. The Senate immediately deified him. Julius Caesar had been deified after death. Now Augustus was a god too, worshipped in temples across the empire. The Republic was gone forever, replaced by the empire, though Romans would maintain the fiction that it still existed for centuries to come. Tiberius inherited a stable, prosperous empire, and he nearly broke it through paranoia and cruelty. Tiberius started well enough. He was an excellent general, an experienced administrator, and initially, a conscientious ruler. He was 56 when he became emperor, and he took the job seriously. He sat in the Senate, debated with senators as equals, and tried to maintain Augustus's system. But Tiberius was deeply unhappy. He'd been forced to divorce a wife he loved, marry a woman who despised him, and watch as Augustus preferred his blood relatives over him. He was naturally suspicious, made worse by the fact that people really were plotting against him. The job of emperor meant living with constant assassination threats, real and imagined. In 23 CE, Tiberius's son Drusus died, possibly poisoned by Lucius alias Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who had become Tiberius's right-hand man. Sejanus was ambitious and ruthless. He concentrated the Praetorian Guard, previously scattered in barracks around Rome, into a single fortified camp in the city, giving him direct control of the only armed force near Rome. He whispered poison in Tiberius's ear, convincing him that everyone was plotting against him. In 26 CE, Tiberius left Rome for the island of Capri and never returned. He ruled the empire from his villa, sending letters to the Senate, letting Sejanus handle day-to-day affairs in Rome. Later Roman historians claim Tiberius spent his time on Capri engaging in unspeakable sexual perversions, but these accounts are so over-the-top lurid that they're probably exaggerated propaganda. What's certain is that he withdrew from public life almost completely. Sejanus used Tiberius's absence to persecute his enemies, using treason trials to eliminate anyone who opposed him. The crime of maestas, insulting the emperor's majesty, could be applied to almost anything. Nobles were accused, tried, and executed or forced to commit suicide. Their property was confiscated. An atmosphere of terror settled over Rome's elite. In 31 CE, Tiberius finally realized Sejanus was plotting to seize power, possibly planning to murder him. In a brilliant and ruthless move, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate. The senators expected it to grant Sejanus more powers. Instead, it accused him of treason. Sejanus was arrested, strangled in prison, and his body torn apart by a mob. His children were executed. His allies were purged. But the treason trials continued, worse than before, as Tiberius trusted no one. He died in 37 CE at age 77, possibly smothered by the Praetorian prefect Macro to speed things along. Few mourned him. Rome was ready for someone new, someone young and charismatic, someone who represented a fresh start. They got Gaius Caesar, known to history as Caligula, which means little boots, a childhood nickname from when he dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform in the military camps. He was Tiberius's great-nephew and the only surviving male heir. Rome welcomed him with joy. For about 6 months, Caligula was a generous and popular ruler. Then he got sick with a serious illness, possibly encephalitis, and when he recovered, he was insane. Or at least that's the traditional story. Modern historians debate whether Caligula was genuinely mentally ill or just an absolute ruler whose cruelty and megalomania were exaggerated by hostile sources. Either way, what followed was a reign of terror and absurdity. Caligula declared himself a living god and demanded worship. He ordered a bridge of boats built across the Bay of Naples so he could ride his horse across it, supposedly to surpass Xerxes. He planned to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. He'd have people executed for trivial reasons or no reason at all, sometimes forcing parents to watch their children die. He seized property arbitrarily, banished or executed senators on whims, and taxed everything imaginable, including prostitution, to fund his extravagances. He launched a military expedition to Germany, achieved nothing, then declared victory and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells on the beach as spoils of the ocean. He started to build a bridge from his palace to the temple of Jupiter so he could visit his fellow gods. He supposedly had sexual relations with his sisters and sold the rights to sleep with other senators' wives. How much of this is true is debatable. Ancient sources were written by people who hated him, and they had every reason to exaggerate. But even if half of it is propaganda, Caligula was clearly a disaster. In January 41 CE, after less than 4 years as emperor, the Praetorian Guard assassinated him, along with his wife and infant daughter, whose head was smashed against a wall. The Praetorians then found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Claudius was 50 years old, had a limp, a stutter, and had been mocked his whole life as the family idiot. The Praetorians dragged him out and declared him emperor, because they needed an emperor, and he was the only adult male left in the Julio-Claudian line. Everybody expected Claudius to be a puppet. They were wrong. Claudius proved to be one of Rome's most capable emperors. He was actually a brilliant scholar, having spent decades studying history, while everyone dismissed him as stupid because of his physical disabilities. He understood how the empire worked better than most. Claudius reformed the bureaucracy, creating a professional civil service staffed largely by freedmen, ex-slaves who owed their positions to him rather than to the aristocracy. He personally oversaw legal cases, sometimes sitting in judgment from dawn until midnight. He expanded the Senate, adding Gauls from across the Alps, arguing that Rome's strength came from incorporating new peoples. In 43 CE, he launched the conquest of Britain. It wasn't militarily necessary, but it gave him military glory and legitimacy, showing he wasn't just a scholar but a warrior emperor. Roman legions under Aulus Plautius invaded, and Claudius himself came to Britain for the final assault on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, riding on an elephant to overawe the Britons. Britain became a Roman province, though the northern parts would never be fully conquered. Claudius built a new port for Rome at Ostia and a massive aqueduct to bring fresh water to the city. He passed laws protecting slaves from abuse and granting them freedom if their masters abandoned them when sick. He was genuinely trying to be a good emperor. But his personal life was a disaster. His third wife, Messalina, was notorious for her affairs. According to sources, while Claudius was away, she actually held a bigamous wedding ceremony with one of her lovers and planned to overthrow Claudius. When Claudius found out, he had her executed. His fourth wife was even worse. Agrippina the Younger was Claudius's niece, and marrying her required changing the law against incest. She was beautiful, intelligent, and monstrously ambitious. She had a son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and she was determined to make him emperor. She convinced Claudius to adopt Lucius, who took the name Nero Claudius Caesar. In 54 CE, Claudius died after eating poisoned mushrooms. Everyone suspected Agrippina, though nothing was ever proven. Nero became emperor at 16 years old, with his mother expecting to rule through him. Nero would become synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and madness, but his story is more complicated than the legend suggests. Let your mind drift here. We're moving through emperors now like water flowing downhill, each reign bleeding into the next, the pattern of good emperors and bad, competence and madness playing out again and again. It's okay if you're starting to lose track. That's the point. Let history wash over you. Nero's first 5 years as emperor were actually pretty good, guided by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. They ran the empire while Nero indulged his artistic passions, writing poetry, singing, and acting. He lowered taxes, improved legal protections for slaves, and generally didn't interfere too much. But Agrippina tried to control him, and Nero resented it. As he grew older, he pushed back against her influence, and she responded by threatening to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as a rival. Nero had Britannicus poisoned at a dinner party. He was 14 years old. Agrippina became more vocal in her opposition. Nero tried to have her killed multiple times. He built her a collapsible boat that was supposed to sink and drown her, but she swam to shore. Finally, he just sent soldiers to beat her to death. According to legend, she bared her womb and said, "Strike here," where she had carried Nero. The soldiers obliged. Nero divorced his first wife Octavia, Claudius's daughter, and had her executed so he could marry his mistress Poppaea Sabina. Later, he'd kick Poppaea to death while she was pregnant, possibly by accident in a rage, possibly deliberately. He then castrated a slave boy who resembled Poppaea and married him in a public ceremony, dressing the boy in empress's robes. Nero's sexuality and relationships were complicated, and by Roman standards, scandalous. In 64 CE, a massive fire devastated Rome, burning for 6 days and destroying much of the city. Rumor spread that Nero had started it so he could rebuild Rome to his own design. The rumor that he fiddled while Rome burned is false on 2 counts. The fiddle didn't exist yet, and he wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. But he did use the cleared land to build the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a massive palace complex with a 30-meter-tall statue of himself as a sun god. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero scapegoated a new religious sect called Christians. They were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific ways. Some were covered in pitch and set on fire as human torches to light Nero's gardens. Others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. This was the first major Roman persecution of Christians, making Nero a villain in Christian tradition for centuries to come. Nero's spending bankrupted the treasury. He debased the currency, confiscated property from wealthy citizens accused of treason, and taxed everything. His artistic pretensions embarrassed the Roman elite. He performed in public theaters, singing and acting, which were considered disgraceful for an aristocrat, let alone an emperor. He competed in the Olympic Games, where he bribed judges to declare him winner, even in a chariot race where he fell out of his chariot and didn't finish. In 65 CE, a conspiracy to assassinate Nero and replace him with a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso was discovered. Nero responded with a bloodbath. Dozens of senators and nobles were executed, including Seneca, who was forced to commit suicide. The poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew, was also forced to kill himself. He recited his own poetry as he bled to death. By 68 CE, Nero had lost all support. Governors of provinces across the empire rebelled. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He fled Rome and, unable to bring himself to commit suicide, had a secretary help him drive a dagger into his throat. His last words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, descended from Augustus, was extinct. Rome had no clear heir. Multiple generals would claim the throne, and for the first time since Augustus, civil war would decide who ruled. The year of the 4 emperors, 69 CE, saw chaos across the empire. Galba, an elderly senator and governor of Spain, was declared emperor by his legions. He marched on Rome, but his harsh discipline and refusal to pay promised bonuses made him unpopular. Otho, one of Nero's former friends who'd been exiled after Nero stole his wife Poppaea, conspired with the Praetorian Guard to murder Galba. Otho became emperor, but the legions in Germany had already declared their own candidate, Vitellius. Otho's forces fought Vitellius's at Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho lost and committed suicide rather than prolong the civil war. Vitellius entered Rome and proceeded to eat and drink himself into obesity while his soldiers looted the city. Meanwhile, the legions in the east declared their own candidate, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, called Vespasian. Vespasian was a military man from a middle-class background, not an aristocrat. He'd been commanding Roman forces in Judea, suppressing the first Jewish revolt that had erupted in 66 CE. He was competent, pragmatic, and tough. His legions marched on Rome. Vitellius's forces were defeated, and Vitellius himself was dragged through Rome and killed by a mob. His body was thrown into the Tiber. Vespasian became emperor in December 69 CE, founding the Flavian dynasty. He stabilized the empire, restored discipline to the legions, refilled the empty treasury through taxation and confiscations, and rebuilt Rome. He started construction on the Colosseum, officially the Flavian amphitheater, on the site of Nero's Golden House. It was a brilliant bit of propaganda, turning Nero's private extravagance into a public monument for the people. Vespasian was a no-nonsense emperor with a sense of humor. When his son Titus complained about attacks on public urinals, Vespasian held up a coin and asked if it smelled. And yet, he said, it comes from urine. That's where we get the phrase, money doesn't stink. When he was dying in 79 CE, his last words were a joke. Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god, mocking the practice of deifying emperors. His son Titus succeeded him and ruled for only 2 years, but they were eventful. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and lava, freezing them in time for archaeologists to discover centuries later. In 80 CE, a fire raged through Rome, followed by a plague. Titus worked tirelessly to provide relief, earning genuine love from the people. When he died in 81 CE, possibly from illness, possibly poisoned by his brother, Rome mourned. That brother was Domitian, who became the last Flavian emperor. Domitian was capable but autocratic and paranoid. He insisted on being called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He ruthlessly suppressed any perceived disloyalty, executing senators and aristocrats on the flimsiest evidence. He won military victories in Germany and Dacia but was happiest in Rome, controlling everything personally. His reign of terror eventually prompted a conspiracy. In 96 CE, he was stabbed to death in his bedroom by members of his own household, including his wife Domitia, who allegedly knew about the plot. The Senate rejoiced, immediately damning his memory and ordering his name chiseled off monuments. With Domitian dead and no clear heir, the Senate elevated one of their own, an elderly senator named Marcus Cocceius Nerva. He was a compromise candidate, chosen precisely because he was old and unlikely to rule long. But Nerva did something remarkably smart. He adopted a successful general named Marcus Ulpius Traianus, called Trajan, as his heir, establishing a precedent that would define the next century. When Nerva died in 98 CE after less than 2 years as emperor, Trajan became the first emperor born outside Italy. He was from Hispania, modern Spain, proof that the empire had become more than just Rome writ large. And Trajan would become one of Rome's greatest emperors, the model against which all later rulers were measured. Trajan was a soldier's soldier, tough, competent, and personally brave. He led from the front, shared his soldiers' hardships, and won their fanatical loyalty. Under his reign, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, in 2 brutal campaigns from 101 to 106 CE, adding vast gold mines that enriched Rome for generations. Trajan's column in Rome commemorates these wars with a spiral relief showing the campaigns in incredible detail. Then Trajan turned east. Parthia had been Rome's rival for over a century, and Trajan decided to settle things permanently. In 113 CE, he invaded, conquering Armenia, Mesopotamia, and even briefly capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. Roman legions reached the Persian Gulf for the first and only time in history. But Trajan had overreached. The conquered territories erupted in revolt. Jewish communities across the east rebelled. Trajan's supply lines were stretched thin. He died in 117 CE while trying to return to Rome, possibly from a stroke, possibly from illness. He was 63. Trajan had adopted his cousin, Publius Aelius Hadrianus, called Hadrian, shortly before his death. Hadrian immediately pulled back from Trajan's conquests, recognizing they were unsustainable. He abandoned Mesopotamia and Armenia, returning to the Euphrates as the empire's eastern frontier. It was a controversial decision, seen by some as abandoning Roman glory, but it was strategically wise. Hadrian spent most of his reign traveling the empire, visiting every province, personally inspecting defenses, settling disputes, and building monuments. In Britain, he built Hadrian's Wall from coast to coast, marking the empire's northern limit. In Judea, he rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman colony, renaming it Aelia Capitolina and building a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. This triggered the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136 CE, a brutal conflict that devastated Judea. Rome eventually crushed the revolt, killing hundreds of thousands of Jews, but the war showed that even at its height, the empire faced constant resistance. Hadrian was cultured, intellectual, and bisexual, openly mourning when his beloved Antinous drowned in the Nile, and founding a city, Antinopolis, in his memory. He built the Pantheon in Rome, still standing today with the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed in the ancient world. He was one of the 5 good emperors, a series of rulers from 96 to 180 CE who chose their successors based on merit rather than blood, creating almost a century of stability and prosperity. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE and was so peaceful and competent that his reign is almost boring compared to what came before. Then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as Rome's ideal ruler, a Stoic philosopher who wrote the Meditations, a personal journal of philosophical reflections that's still read today. He didn't want to be emperor, preferred philosophy to power, but he did his duty, spending most of his reign fighting wars on the northern frontier against Germanic tribes and the Parthians in the east. The empire was changing. Plague swept through in the 160s, possibly smallpox killing millions. The northern frontiers were under constant pressure from Germanic migrations. The economy was straining under military costs. Marcus Aurelius handled it all with grim determination, writing in his Meditations about accepting fate and doing one's duty without complaint. His one great mistake was breaking the tradition of adoptive succession. Instead of choosing the best man to succeed him, Marcus named his biological son, Commodus, as his heir. It's understandable. He was a father who loved his son, but it was a disaster for Rome. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, was everything his father wasn't. He was vain, cruel, and insane. He thought he was the reincarnation of Hercules and dressed accordingly, wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club. He fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, always winning because who's going to defeat the emperor? He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, and renamed the months too. His reign was chaos. He left governance to favorites and freedmen while he indulged his delusions. Finally, in 192 CE, his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain, and the Praetorian prefect conspired to kill him. They tried poison, but Commodus vomited it up, so they sent in a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. Commodus's death ended the Antonine dynasty and triggered another civil war. And if you're still awake, if you're still listening, you might be noticing a pattern. Rome has cycles. Good emperors followed by bad, peace followed by war, stability followed by chaos. It's like a heartbeat or waves on a shore, rising and falling, rising and falling. Let that rhythm carry you. We're past the halfway point now, heading toward Rome's long decline, but there are still centuries to go. After Commodus came another civil war, another year of the 5 emperors. I'll spare you the details. The winner was Septimius Severus, a general from North Africa who founded the Severan dynasty. Severus was tough, pragmatic, and his deathbed advice to his sons was, enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. That tells you everything about where Rome was heading. The army was everything now. Emperors needed military support to survive, and they bought it with cash. The Senate's power had withered to almost nothing. Provinces were governed by military men. The empire was becoming a military state, and that had consequences. Severus's son Caracalla, who ruled from 211 to 217 CE, extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 CE with the Constitutio Antoniniana. This sounds generous, but it was mainly a tax grab, since citizens paid different, often higher taxes. Still, it completed a process centuries in the making, turning the empire into a genuinely multicultural state where being Roman was about citizenship, not ethnicity. Caracalla also built massive public baths in Rome, second only to Diocletian's in size, and was generally a brutal military emperor who spent most of his reign campaigning. He was assassinated in 217 CE by the Praetorian prefect while urinating on the side of the road, which is an undignified way to go. The Severan dynasty stumbled through a few more emperors, each worse than the last. Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 CE, was a teenage Syrian priest of the sun god Elgabal who tried to make his deity supreme in Rome, married a Vestal virgin, supposedly worked as a prostitute in the palace, and was generally so scandalous that the Praetorian Guard murdered him and his mother and threw their bodies in the Tiber. He was 18. His cousin Severus Alexander tried to be a good emperor from 222 to 235 CE, but he was dominated by his mother and was seen as weak. When he tried to buy peace with Germanic tribes instead of fighting them, his soldiers mutinied and killed him. And with that, Rome plunged into the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period from 235 to 284 CE, when the empire nearly collapsed completely. During the crisis, Rome had about 50 emperors in 50 years, most ruling for only months before being overthrown or killed. The legions elected and murdered emperors at will. The frontiers collapsed under barbarian pressure. Plague swept through repeatedly. The economy crashed as emperors debased the currency to pay the armies. Provinces broke away, forming short-lived splinter empires. In the west, the Gallic Empire, centered in Gaul and Britain, split off from 260 to 274 CE. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire, led by Queen Zenobia, seized Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor from 267 to 272 CE. The empire was fragmenting. Germanic tribes, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, and others raided across the frontiers. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians in 224 CE, invaded the east. In 260 CE, the Persian king Shapwari captured the Emperor Valerian in battle, a humiliation unprecedented in Roman history. Valerian died in captivity, and according to Persian legend, Shapwari used his stuffed skin as a footstool. But Rome didn't die. Somehow, against all odds, it survived. Soldier emperors like Claudius II, who ruled from 268 to 270 CE and earned the name Gothicus for defeating the Goths, and Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 CE and reunified the empire, clawed back the lost territories. Aurelian reconquered the Palmyrene Empire and the Gallic Empire, restored order, and began economic reforms. He built massive walls around Rome itself, the Aurelian Walls, acknowledging that the capital was no longer safe from invasion. These emperors were tough, capable men from the provinces, not sophisticated aristocrats. They saved Rome through sheer grit, but the empire that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from what came before. In 284 CE, a general named Diocles seized power. He would become known as Diocletian, and he would transform the empire completely, creating a system that would last for centuries, long after his death. Diocletian realized Rome was too large for one man to govern. In 285 CE, he appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule the west while he ruled the east. They took the title Augustus. Then in 293 CE, he appointed two junior emperors called Caesars, Constantius in the west and Galerius in the east. This system, called the Tetrarchy or Rule of Four, divided the empire into manageable chunks, each with its own administration and army. Diocletian reformed everything. He reorganized the provinces, splitting large ones into smaller units for easier control. He separated civil and military administration, ensuring governors couldn't use their troops to rebel. He reformed the army, increasing its size and creating mobile field armies to respond to threats. He tried to fix the economy with the edict on maximum prices, setting legal price limits on everything from grain to haircuts, though it mostly failed because you can't legislate economics. He also reformed the currency, introducing new coins with higher precious metal content. He reformed taxation, conducting a census and imposing regular tax assessments across the empire. The imperial administration grew massive, becoming the bureaucratic state that would characterize the later empire. Diocletian also launched the last and greatest persecution of Christians. Christianity had been growing steadily for centuries, spreading through the empire's cities and even reaching the upper classes and military. Diocletian, a traditionalist who believed Rome's strength came from the old gods, saw Christianity as a threat. In 303 CE, he ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the persecution of Christians who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods. The Great Persecution was brutal but ultimately counterproductive. Christians were too numerous and too organized. Martyrdom strengthened their resolve, and one of the Tetrarch's successors would change everything. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something unprecedented. He voluntarily retired, the only Roman emperor to do so successfully. He abdicated and forced Maximian to do the same, allowing the two Caesars to become Augusti and appoint new Caesars. Diocletian spent his remaining years in his palace at Split in Dalmatia, modern Croatia, growing cabbages. When urged to return to power during later civil wars, he allegedly said, "If you could show the cabbages that I planted with my own hands, you definitely wouldn't be asking me to do that." But his system didn't survive his retirement. The Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war as multiple claimants fought for power. From this chaos emerged Constantine, son of Constantius, who would become the most influential emperor since Augustus. Constantine was proclaimed Augustus by his father's troops in York, Britain, in 306 CE after Constantius died, but there were multiple other claimants, and Constantine spent years fighting civil wars to secure his position. The decisive moment came in 312 CE at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Constantine was facing Maxentius, who controlled Rome and Italy. According to later Christian accounts, the night before the battle, Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. The next day, Constantine won a crushing victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber trying to flee. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian god. The following year, 313 CE, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire and ending the persecution of Christians. Constantine began favoring Christianity, donating land and money to build churches, exempting clergy from taxes, and involving himself in church disputes. This was a revolutionary change. For centuries, Rome's emperors had been Pontifex Maximus, chief priests of the traditional Roman religion. Now Constantine was aligning himself with a religion that had been persecuted just years before. He wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed in 337 CE, and he continued to use traditional Roman religious imagery, but his support transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority into the empire's dominant religion. Constantine defeated Licinius in 324 CE, becoming sole emperor of a reunified empire. He then did something even more dramatic. He founded a new capital in the east, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, at the strategic point where Europe and Asia meet. He renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and it would be the center of the Roman Empire for the next 1,000 years. Constantinople was built as a Christian city from the start, with churches instead of pagan temples, and it was strategically positioned to defend the wealthy eastern provinces and control trade routes. Rome was still important symbolically, but power had shifted east. Constantine reorganized the government and military, continuing Diocletian's reforms, but putting his own stamp on them. He created a mobile field army, the comitatenses, separate from the frontier troops. He further expanded the bureaucracy and court ceremonial, making the emperor increasingly remote and godlike. He solidified the dominance of Christianity by convening the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where bishops from across the empire met to resolve theological disputes, producing the Nicene Creed that's still recited in churches today. When Constantine died in 337 CE, his three sons divided the empire and then proceeded to fight each other. The empire fragmented and reunified repeatedly over the next few decades. But the changes Constantine had made, the Christianization of the empire and the shift eastward, were permanent. The later 4th century saw capable emperors like Julian, called the Apostate, because he tried to restore paganism during his brief reign from 361 to 363 CE, and Valentinian I, who defended the frontiers effectively. But the pressure was building. Germanic tribes, pushed westward by the Huns migrating from Central Asia, were massing on the empire's borders, seeking refuge and land. In 376 CE, the Goths, fleeing the Huns, asked permission to cross the Danube and settle in Roman territory. Emperor Valens agreed, seeing them as a source of recruits and taxpayers. But Roman officials abused and exploited the Gothic refugees, and the Goths rebelled. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army and killed Valens himself. It was the worst Roman military disaster since Cannae, and it marked a turning point. The Goths couldn't be expelled, they had to be accommodated. Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395 CE, made peace with them, allowing them to settle as foederati, federated allies who kept their own leaders and fought for Rome in exchange for land and subsidies. It was a pragmatic solution, but a dangerous precedent. The empire was now dependent on barbarian armies it couldn't fully control. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule a unified empire. When he died in 395 CE, he split it between his two sons. Arcadius got the east, Honorius the west. It was supposed to be temporary, a division of administration, not sovereignty. The empire was still theoretically one, but the two halves would never be reunified. From 395 CE on, you have the Western Roman Empire, centered on Italy, and the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, which would eventually be called the Byzantine Empire by historians, though they always called themselves Romans. The Western Empire was in trouble. It was poorer than the East, with a smaller tax base and a longer, more vulnerable frontier. The government was weak, dominated by military strongmen. Germanic tribes were settling across the West, nominally as allies but increasingly independent. The Western emperors were often children or figureheads, real power held by military commanders like Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who effectively ran the West for years. In 406 CE, a wave of tribes, Vandals, Alans, Suevi, crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. Roman defenses collapsed. By 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, who had been a Roman ally, marched on Rome itself. The city's walls, which hadn't been breached by a foreign enemy in 800 years, were opened by treachery or negligence. For 3 days, the Goths sacked Rome. The psychological shock was immense. Rome, the eternal city, had fallen. St. Augustine wrote The City of God, partly in response, arguing that earthly cities, even Rome, were transient, but the city of God was eternal. It was cold comfort. Rome was sacked again in 455 CE by the Vandals, who had crossed into North Africa in 429 CE and established a kingdom there, cutting off the grain supply that fed Italy. The Vandal sack was more thorough than the Visigothic one, stripping the city of treasures, including supposedly the treasures of Solomon's temple that the Romans had taken from Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Western Empire was dying slowly, painfully, like an old man fadding away. The emperors were increasingly irrelevant puppets. Real power was held by Germanic generals who made and unmade emperors at will. Vast territories were lost. Britain was abandoned in the early 5th century, left to defend itself against Saxon invaders. Gaul, Spain, North Africa all slipped away, carved up by Germanic kingdoms that ruled in their own right, sometimes acknowledging Roman authority, often not. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who commanded the barbarian troops in Italy, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, Little Romulus Augustus, echoing both Rome's founder and its first emperor. Odoacer didn't bother to appoint a new emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a king. Modern historians mark this as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but contemporaries didn't see it that way. There was still a Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople. The West hadn't fallen so much as it had been transformed, with Germanic kings ruling former Roman territories, often adopting Roman titles, laws, and administration. The end was messy, ambiguous, not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow transformation. But for our purposes for this story, let's pause here. The Western Empire is gone. The city of Rome, once master of the world, is now just another city, ruled by barbarian kings. Its population collapsed from over 1 million to perhaps 50,000, its great buildings crumbling, its aqueducts broken, the forum where senators once debated overgrown with weeds. And yet the story isn't over, because in the east, the Roman Empire continued. Constantinople remained, wealthy, powerful, enduring. For another 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, would survive, carrying the legacy of Rome into the medieval world. Let's drift through these later centuries more quickly now, like a dream speeding up, images flashing past, the way memories blur when you're falling asleep. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, faced its own crises. In the 5th and 6th centuries, it fought off Persian invasions, dealt with religious controversies that threatened to tear the empire apart, and struggled to maintain order. But under Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, the Eastern Empire experienced a last renaissance of Roman glory. Justinian was ambitious, driven by the dream of reunifying the Roman Empire, of reconquering the lost West. He was aided by his wife Theodora, a former actress who became one of the most powerful women in Roman history, and by his brilliant generals, especially Belisarius and Narses. Justinian's armies reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and part of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was almost a Roman lake again. Justinian also codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a massive compilation that preserved Roman legal thought and influenced European law for centuries. He rebuilt Constantinople, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, which stood as the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Its dome seemed to float impossibly, and when it was completed, Justinian supposedly said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." But Justinian's reconquests were expensive and unsustainable. Plague struck in 541 CE, the plague of Justinian, possibly bubonic plague, killing millions across the empire. The wars dragged on, bleeding the treasury dry. After Justinian died, much of Italy was lost to the Lombards, a new Germanic people who invaded from the north. The reconquest had been a brief dream. The 7th century brought disaster. The Sassanid Persians invaded, conquering Syria, Palestine, and Egypt by 620 CE. Jerusalem fell. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was captured. The empire seemed on the verge of destruction. But Emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641 CE, launched a desperate counterattack. In a series of brilliant campaigns from 622 to 628 CE, he invaded Persia itself, marching deep into enemy territory, destroying Persian armies threatening their capital. The Persians sued for peace, returning all conquered territories. Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph, restoring the true cross. It was Rome's last great military victory over Persia. But both empires were exhausted, bled white by decades of war. And in the Arabian Peninsula, something new was emerging. A prophet named Muhammad had united the Arab tribes under a new religion, Islam. When Muhammad died in 632 CE, his successors, the caliphs, launched a wave of conquest that would change the world. Arab armies poured out of the desert, destroying a Persian army at Qadisiyah in 636 CE and a Byzantine army at Yarmouk in 636 CE. Within a decade, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia were lost to the Byzantines, and the entire Sassanid Persian Empire had collapsed. By the end of the 7th century, Arabs controlled everything from Spain to Central Asia. The Byzantine Empire survived, but it was transformed. Greek replaced Latin as the official language. The theme system reorganized provinces into military districts. The empire became medieval, Eastern Greek. Though it still called itself Roman, for the next 800 years it would endure, fighting off Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders, and finally Ottoman Turks. If you're still awake, still listening, you're probably wondering when this ends. Soon, let yourself relax. These later centuries can blend together. We're in the home stretch now. The Byzantine Empire's story is one of survival against impossible odds. In the 8th century, it nearly fell to Arab sieges of Constantinople in 674-678 and 717-718 CE, saved by Greek fire, a secret weapon that burned even on water, and by massive walls that protected the capital. The empire shrank and expanded, sometimes controlling most of the Balkans and Asia Minor, sometimes reduced to little more than Constantinople and its surroundings. In the 11th century, the Byzantines faced new threats. The Seljuk Turks, recently converted to Islam, invaded from the east, destroying a Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071 CE and conquering most of Asia Minor, the empire's heartland. From the west came the Normans, seizing Byzantine Italy. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who ruled from 1081 to 1118 CE, appealed to the Pope for help against the Turks. The Pope responded by calling the First Crusade, sending tens of thousands of Western European knights east to reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusades were a mixed blessing for Byzantium. The Crusaders did help push back the Turks, but they were also arrogant, difficult allies who treated the Byzantines with contempt, seeing them as effeminate Greeks, not true Romans. In 1204 CE, disaster struck. The Fourth Crusade, diverted by Venetian politics and greed, attacked and sacked Constantinople itself. Western knights looted the city for 3 days, destroying libraries, melting down artworks, desecrating churches. They established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, ruling the city for 57 years. It was a catastrophe from which Byzantium never fully recovered. The empire fragmented into multiple successor states. In 1261 CE, Michael VII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople, but the restored empire was a shadow of its former self, bankrupt, weak, surrounded by enemies. For the next 2 centuries, Byzantium slowly died. Territory was lost piece by piece to the expanding Ottoman Turkish Empire. By the 1450s, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself, an island of Christianity in an Islamic sea. In 1453 CE, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire besieged Constantinople with a massive army and powerful cannons that could smash through ancient walls. The city's defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, fought desperately, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. On May 29, 1453, after a siege of 53 days, the Ottomans breached the walls. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, threw off his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be recognized and died fighting in the streets, his body never found. The city fell. The great church of Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. The Ottoman Sultan claimed the title of Caesar, Kayseri Rum in Turkish, the Caesar of Rome. The Roman Empire, which had begun with Romulus on the Palatine Hill in 753 BCE, ended with Constantine XI dying in the streets of Constantinople in 1453 CE. It had lasted, in one form or another, for 2,206 years. No empire before or since has endured so long. But did it really end? The Ottomans claimed Roman succession. The Russian Tsars, Tsar being derived from Caesar, claimed to be the third Rome after Constantinople fell. The Holy Roman Empire in Western Europe, though as Voltaire said, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, claimed the legacy of Charlemagne, who had been crowned Roman emperor in 800 CE. the very concept of empire, of law, of citizenship, all come from Rome. Roman law forms the basis of civil law systems across Europe and Latin America. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are all descended from Latin. The Catholic Church preserved Latin as a sacred language and Roman administrative structures. The architecture of Western civilization, from domed buildings to triumphal arches to city grids, echoes Rome. The story of Rome is the story of Western civilization itself. It's a story of ambition and conquest, of engineering marvels and brutal oppression, of cultural achievement and systemic cruelty. Rome enslaved millions but spread literacy and law. It was a machine of war that also brought unprecedented peace. It was a republic that became a dictatorship that called itself a republic for centuries afterward. Rome's legacy is complicated, often dark, sometimes inspiring. It reminds us that empires rise and fall, that nothing lasts forever, that human ambition can build wonders and cause catastrophes. It reminds us that history is made by real people, flawed, complex, driven by the same desires and fears we all have. And now, more than 1,500 years after the Western Empire fell, more than 500 years after Constantinople fell, we still tell Rome's story. We still study its history, walk among its ruins, debate its meaning. In a way, Rome never really fell. It just changed, evolved, became the foundation on which the modern world was built. So close your eyes now. Let the weight of all those centuries settle over you like a blanket. The story is done. Rome has risen from a village on 7 hills to an empire spanning 3 continents. It has ruled with iron and law, conquered with legions and crucifixes, built monuments that outlasted its power. It has produced heroes and monsters, philosophers and tyrants, ordinary people living extraordinary lives in the shadow of greatness. And you've witnessed it all, from Romulus's first bloody deed to Constantine X's last stand. You've marched with Caesar across the Rubicon, watched Hannibal cross the Alps, stood in the Forum as Cicero spoke, walked the walls of Constantinople as the Ottoman cannons fired. The Roman Empire is gone. Long live the Roman Empire. Its stones are scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its words are written in the laws and languages of dozens of nations. Its spirit, for better and worse, still shapes our world. Rest now. Dream of marble columns and golden eagles, of legions marching on stone roads that stretched from one end of the world to the other, of a time when all roads led to Rome, and Rome led the world. Sleep well, the eternal city awaits you in dreams. Before you drift away completely, if this journey through history has meant something to you, if you found peace in these ancient stories, do me a favor, hit that like button. Leave a comment about which part of Rome's vast story resonated with you most. Was it the Republic's struggle for freedom, Caesar's ambition, Constantine's transformation, the long, slow decline? And subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. There are so many more stories to tell. Ancient Egypt's 3,000 years, the rise and fall of Alexander's empire, the Byzantine Empire's 1,000-year epilogue, the Mongol conquests, the age of exploration, all of human history waiting to be told in the quiet hours of the night. But for now, rest. Let Rome's story fade into the background. Let the rhythm of centuries, the rise and fall of empires, become the heartbeat that carries you into sleep. From the she-wolf nursing twins on a riverbank to the last emperor falling in battle, from the founding to the fall, you've witnessed one of humanity's greatest stories. And tomorrow, when you wake, Rome will still be there, waiting in ruins and books and memories, eternal in the way that only dead empires can be. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for joining me on this journey through time. The end. Thank you for listening to the entire story of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines, like this video, and leave a comment about which emperor or era fascinated you most. Your support helps keep these deep historical explorations alive. Until next time, sleep well and dream of ancient worlds.